Today, I am coming at you from what I like to refer to as my former future residence. That's right, when I was in high school in the first couple of years of a political science degree, I had this grand vision, this dream that one day I would become the president of these United States. In fact, I went so far to make sure I chose the election that I would run for president and win the presidency, 2024. That's right. I'm here today to formally announce my candidacy for president of the. I'm just kidding. It is too late for Nolder 2024. However, I am here today standing in Lafayette Park. Lafayette Park is an extension of the front yard of the White House. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, no, I've seen pictures of the White House. For sure, it's not an extension of the front yard. There's an enormous gate and a road and all those things. Well, it wasn't always that way. In fact, in 1804, Thomas Jefferson was taking a look around and he was in the front yard and he made a decision. He said, you know what does this yard really need? What's missing? He decided to put a road right through the middle of it. And thus you have Pennsylvania Avenue. Lafayette Park, though, or Lafayette Square, actually has a lot of history unto its own. At one point, it was a zoo. It's been a racetrack. During the War of 1812, it was a military encampment. And today, it's pretty famous. Anytime there's a celebration or a protest of the White House, it's happening here in Lafayette Square. But we're not here to talk about Lafayette Square. We're really here to talk about what's behind me. George Washington chose the site for building the White House in 1791. Construction started in 1792, and it took about 8 years to complete it. George Washington was no longer in office, so the first residence, once it was completed, was our second president, John Adams. The White House is a symbol of freedom and democracy, recognized and known all over the world. If we're being honest with ourselves, though, the White House hasn't always been a symbol of freedom for those in America. Back when the White House was being constructed, 1792 to 1800, it was predominantly done by slave labor. In fact, the 50 years that followed its completion, the house was run with slaves. It was in those moments that people had to wrestle with the reality of freedom isn't for everyone. In fact, the very park that I'm standing in, not only was it a zoo and a racetrack and a military encampment during 1812, it was also a place for slave auctions right across the street in the front yard of the White House. Emancipation really didn't start getting a ton of movement until the 1850s. But the first great step was in 1863 by our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all of the slaves in the Confederate States. And while that wasn't a solution for all slaves, it was the first step in the right direction, first substantive step in the right direction. We've got to continue to talk about slavery. It's important because it's a piece of our history, the scar on American history. We can learn so much from it. Like the first thing we can learn is we've got to acknowledge that our country at one point valued people created by the hands of God as property and something to possess and own, and not as human beings or, again, creation of God. We've got to acknowledge that, and it's good for us to acknowledge that out loud. The second thing that we learn from is from the heroes, the abolitionists, who saw the injustice that was happening and decided to do something about it. We can learn a lot from them. Slavery has been a scar on American history, but honestly, it's been a scar on many countries and nations' histories. Not just here, but many continents and throughout the centuries. Slavery has been an issue as long as humanity's been humanity. Would you be surprised to know that there was a conversation in the life of Jesus that actually centered around slavery? Let's take a look at that conversation. Let's take a look at the book of John, chapter 8, and see what Jesus has to say. So here's the setting. Jesus has come to Jerusalem for a pretty popular festival, one that pretty much everyone who's a follower of God in this first century would come to Jerusalem for. And he's been teaching and talking and answering questions of people for a few days now. And he's gotten to where there's a number of people that are from the Jewish religion that have made a decision. You know what? We believe that Jesus is pretty significant. In fact, it would go so far in John chapter 8 to say that they started actually believing in Jesus, right? That's pretty incredible. It's amazing what can happen when we sit down and have a conversation with people and really just answer their questions as best we can. And so Jesus is taking this approach. We pick up in John chapter 8, verse 31, and this is what it says. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples." So when I read that sentence, that phrase, this thought from Jesus, the very first word that sticks out to me is the word if. Like, we've got a choice. Like, if you do this, and then, hey, I'm going to follow through, right? If you do this. I think sometimes we get in a place where it's like, man, Jesus just is forcing this. Jesus isn't forcing anything on anybody. He's just having a conversation saying, hey, here's the deal. If you hold to my teachings, well, then you are truly my disciples. So we get a choice. Ain't nothing forced. We get a choice in it. The second thing that really sticks out to me is he says it's my teaching. Not just teaching in general, not just knowledge in general. He says, my teaching, if you hold on to my teaching. And now when we look at Jesus' teaching, there's a lot. I mean, there's hundreds of things that Jesus says. Thankfully, Jesus knew that it might be difficult to memorize all of them. And so he kind of summarized. In fact, someone else was having a conversation with him. Was like, hey, what's the most important piece of this teaching? And Jesus said, I can sum it up like this. Love God with every single thing that you have. The second part of that is, and love other people like you do yourself. And he says we can sum up everything, all the teaching in those two things. Love God with everything you've got, and love other people like you do yourself. The last thing that sticks out to me is he says, if you hold to my teaching, or if you latch onto, if you keep your hands around, if you stay in my teaching, then you're truly my disciples. Now, that is probably the most difficult part. I mean, honestly, can't you think of a couple of teachings of Jesus that are a little slippery and a little difficult to hold on to? It's not like we don't understand and recognize Jesus' expectations for us. It's not like we can't see them in our mind. It's just like, man, I just can't grasp them. Or we do grasp, like we do take hold of them, but they're just so difficult to hold on to. And they slip out of our grasp, and suddenly what we had a hold of, we no longer have a hold of. Jesus' teachings sometimes are difficult. They are sometimes complicated. But he wants them to know, he says, hey, if you hold to my teaching, then you are truly my disciples. Now, he wasn't finished with this thought, though. Let's look at the next verse. Jesus continues with, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, this is getting exciting. It's okay, all right, now we're getting somewhere. So if we hold to his teaching, then we're his disciples, and then we'll know the truth, and the truth will set us free. So knowing the truth, that's pretty intense. Like, hey, I want to know the truth. I don't want something to be ambiguous, especially something that impacts my life in a meaningful way. I want to know the truth about it. Like, just give it to me straight. Don't beat around the bush. Just give me the straight answers. I want to know the truth. Now, what's interesting is when we're trying to figure out really big questions in our life, a lot of times we want to focus on what's the truth for this particular question, right? What makes us feel good about this question? And a lot of times there's questions in our lives that are really difficult to answer. And it just is what it is. And a lot of times if we get stuck on the question piece and we want to have an answer to that really big question, right? There's a lot of things debated right here and protested about and celebrated here at the Supreme Court. And we want to have an answer to those questions. But I don't think the answer to those questions actually start here. They start a little further upstream, up the road. They start with some principles and ideas about what Jesus teaches and who Jesus wants us to be. And those things inform these answers that manifest themselves in our everyday lives. And so we've got to start with his teachings and being a follower of him, so that when we get to really difficult places, we can say, hey, you know what? There is a truth that we're going to hold on to. There are some principles that I'm going to make sure that I have a firm grasp on, and that is going to give me some freedom in those really difficult moments, in those extremely difficult spaces. Now, what's interesting is that when I read that, that's how I respond. However, the audience of the day, when Jesus said this to them, this is not how they responded at all. In fact, let's take a look at the next verse and let's take a look at how they responded to what Jesus said. John 8:33. They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" So they take a look at what Jesus says. They take a listen to what Jesus says. And the only thing that alarms them is the idea that he's insinuating that they're not free, right? That's the only thing. They weren't upset with, hey, if you hold to my teaching, and his teaching being some different teaching that he was used to, that didn't upset them. They weren't upset about the insinuation that maybe they could be followers of him. That wasn't a big deal. It was any of the things that normally would kind of stand out, even the word if, like none of that was there. It was just simply this idea of, and the truth will set you free. And that set them off because, hey, we ain't slaves to nobody. What could we be made free from? And they kind of call on their heritage. They say, hey, we're ancestors of Abraham. Do you know who Abraham is? There's no chance. There is zero chance that we are enslaved, that we have to be set free from anything. Now, what's really interesting is, obviously, one of two things is happening. The first thing is they're having a severe case of amnesia, and they just have forgotten what they've read about their own people's history. For sure, there is no doubt that the people of God, that the people of Israel were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt. And then beyond that, there was an exile to the city of Babylon for about 70 years, right, where they were someone else's people. And then, just in case that wasn't enough for them to look back in the history books to remember, there's a really good chance that within earshot of this conversation, there are Roman soldiers, because currently, at this very moment that Jesus is talking, Jerusalem is occupied by Rome, right? And so even in this moment, they're not their own people. So I don't know if they've forgotten all those things and they just want to be oblivious to it, or hey, they can call us theirs, but really we're all whatever. I don't know what that is. Or the second option is they realize that Jesus is talking about a different level of slavery and freedom, that they're realizing that there's a spiritual element to what this is. Maybe the reference to their ancestor, to Father Abraham, is fairly significant to them. And so they're saying, hey, it doesn't matter what happens whether it's Egypt or Babylon or Rome at the time. The truth is that God made a promise to Abraham, and that promise is not only good for him, it's good for us. And that is, we are a chosen people. So put us in bondage, put us in slaves, you still can't take away the fact that we are God's people. And maybe that's where it's at. There's this deep-rooted idea of being free. We actually find it in a collection of Jewish laws called the Mishnah. And this is what it says. Even the poorest in Israel are looked upon as free men who have lost their possessions, for they are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're saying, hey, it doesn't matter what our worldly circumstances are. There is nothing you can do to take away the promise that God has given us, and that is freedom. Now, what's really fascinating is the way that Jesus responds to it. Because up until this point, I'm on their side. I'm like, you're right. God did give a promise to Abraham, a promise that he would be the father of many and many nations, and that through his lineage, he would bless the world. Eventually, we get Jesus from the line of Abraham, right? And so I'm on their side. But then Jesus says something that completely takes their breath away. Let's look at the next verse. Jesus replied in verse 34. Very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Man, they did not see that one coming. They were ready to defend themselves. They were ready to talk about the promise that God had given to Abraham and how they were going to hold on to that promise, and that promise now belonged to them. They were ready to go. And then Jesus hits them with this statement that just says, hey, here's the deal. It doesn't matter what promise God has given Abraham or anything like that. There's an incomplete piece to this, and I'm completing the piece now that I'm here. This is part of my teaching, and here it goes. Everyone who sinned is now a slave to sin. Man, they didn't see that coming. Did you see that coming? And notice when he says everyone, obviously he was talking to the audience in front of him. But when we begin to look at it and study it for ourselves, everyone means everyone. It's not just in that particular moment in time, but it spans all of time. Anyone who's been guilty of a mistake in God's direction, that we become slaves to that sin. Now, that has really two pieces to it. The first one is spiritual slavery. It's the idea that ultimately we belong to our sin so much that it can keep us separated from God. That it's the ultimate divider. It's the ultimate separator between us and the goodness of God and the person of God. But then the second piece is the one that we're probably a little bit more familiar with, right? It's the every single day kind of slavery to sin. Yeah, sure, when we begin to get involved in something that goes against what God desires for us, at first it's exciting, or it's exhilarating, it gets our heart going, gets some adrenaline going. We're like, man, this feels good, right? This is good. Like, I know it's not the right thing, but I'm not hurting anybody, or fill in the blank, whatever our justification is. Like, man, we're involved in this. Like, it's not a huge deal. I mean, obviously, it is what it is, right? But the truth is, the longer that behavior continues or that thought process continues, the more we become dependent on it, and it becomes a part of our everyday life. And before you know it, you wake up one morning and you look in the mirror and realize that you now are property of your struggle. You belong to your sin. And that's what Jesus was saying. Do you have any of those sins or struggles? Have you had that moment when you looked in the mirror? Maybe you were laying on the floor, or maybe it was late one night and you couldn't sleep in bed and you realized, this thing owns me. This thing's got my number. I belong to this thing now. It's become who I am. Jesus is just being upfront about it. Remember, this whole thing started with, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And he's just letting them know, hey, here's the truth. Now, what do we do with that? What do we do with this idea that everyone who sins is a slave to sin? Is there any hope? Because I for sure identify wholeheartedly as being guilty of that statement. That I've made plenty of those mistakes, and I am now a part of that crew. Listen to how Jesus responds. Verse 35 and 36. And now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So there is hope, right? Jesus is giving us the truth, but he's saying, hey, there's more to it than just the hard truth, right? The truth is that we are owned by our struggles. We're owned by our sin. But he says, hey, here's the deal. While we have no permanent standing in the house of God, while we don't have the authority or the ability to bring our own freedom, he says, but the Son is a permanent resident in the house of God. And the Son does have that ability to set you free. So if the Son does move in your direction and make that decision to give you your freedom, then you are actually free. And Jesus says, hey, I'm that Son. He said, I'm the Son of God. I have the ability to move in your direction. So the question becomes, right? Well, how do we look at that word, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed? How do we get rid of the if and just say, hey, for me personally, I don't want to have an if. I want to say, you know what? The Son has set me free. I am free indeed. Well, we got to go back up to the beginning of the conversation where he says, if you hold to my teaching, then you will be truly my disciples, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So we go back to that question we asked a few minutes ago. What are the teachings that you're having a difficult time holding on to? What are the things that are in your life right now? They're probably firing off in your brain. It's like, man, I know for sure this is the thing. This is the teaching. I can't hold on to this. And because I can't hold on to this teaching, it's creating this slavery in my life where I'm belonging to a struggle because I can't stay holding on to the teaching that Jesus has given me. So what are those for you? Probably one of the biggest ones for a lot of us is forgiveness. It's the ability to forgive someone who not only has done you wrong, but maybe is not even sorry about it, not repentant at all. They haven't even thought about the impact of what their words have made on you or their actions have made on you, and yet we're still called to extend forgiveness in their direction. Maybe that's it. Or maybe it's greed. Maybe you are so buttoned up and so uptight that there is nothing that you have in your life that reflects the generosity of Jesus. And greed is just something that's absolutely taken hold of who you are. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's a lack of compassion where you see other people that are in a place of struggle. And because you're like, well, I don't have the ability, I don't have the empathetic gene. Maybe compassion never flows from you, this action that moves in the direction of people who are less fortunate. And maybe that's your issue. Maybe it's just plain old self-discipline, where you know the good you ought to do, it's just difficult sometimes. And we can't convince ourselves to do the hard things sometimes, even though we know it's for our own good. I think the important thing for 2023 is that you identify that one thing. I think the really important thing for you is you identify, here's the one thing that I just can't hold on to. And you ask the question, what does Jesus teach about this? Because that's what Jesus is asking you to do. He's saying, know the teaching, but hold on to the teaching. And so maybe it's not enough just for you to know that Jesus says, hey, let's not be involved in this. What does he teach about it? What are the principles involved in your particular struggle that says, man, this is what I should hold on to? And maybe that's it. Maybe we're just trying to hold on to the don't do this. And it keeps slipping out of our fingers. But we don't realize that there's a much deeper piece to the teaching of Jesus that says, hey, it's not just about what you're not supposed to do. There are some principles that he wants to lay the foundation for that helps inform our ability to make better decisions. So let's ask those questions. I can't get into every single one of them because every one of you are unique. However, I can make you a promise. As a church and the lead pastor for your church, I'm telling you, if we can identify your one thing, let's sit and study, or let's read, or look at some resources. Let's dig in together and ask the question, what is Jesus teaching about this? What are the principles that are laid down foundationally in who he is that informs us and how we make a decision about how we want to live our lives? Because we don't want to be owned by any struggle. We don't want to be owned by our struggles. No, we want to be set free. Jesus gives you a promise. Hold on to his teaching, and then you will come to know the truth, and that truth will absolutely set you free. In 2023, what's your one thing? What's your teaching you need to dig into? What's your teaching you need to hold on to? So you've got your one thing, the one thing from Jesus' teaching that you've identified, hey, this is the one thing I can't quite get my hands on and hold on to really well. And so you've said, hey, 2023, I'm going to attack that one thing. I'm going to discover, what does Jesus say about it? I'm not going to get into the symptoms that show in my life. I'm going to get into the principles about that one thing, and I'm going to make some discovery happen and put it to action, right? So you got your one thing. That's very unique to you. I've got one more thing to add to that, but it's not unique to you. It's unique to every single person who's a follower of Jesus. And so, in fact, it applies to all of us. And I've brought you to one of my favorite places in Washington, D.C. to talk to you about it. So January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, granting freedom to all slaves in Confederate states. Now, this was an incredible step in the right direction. However, it didn't solve all of slavery's issues just for the Confederate states and the Confederate slaves, right? He knew that there had to be something further, something bigger than this. He knew that the Constitution of the United States needed to be changed. Because while the Constitution didn't say, hey, go get slaves, for sure it promoted it and enabled it to happen. And so they started to work on amending it. Now, what I think is really interesting is even though the Constitution had things they didn't like about it and things that obviously were a scar on our history, they didn't decide to throw it all out and start new. They decided to fix it, to make changes to it. So they started working on the 13th Amendment, the amendment that would completely abolish slavery everywhere. And so in April 1864, the United States Senate passed it. Just fast forward a little bit more, in January of 1865, the House of Representatives did the same. Fast forward just a little bit more, and it's April 1865, and General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Confederacy, and the war comes to a close. It's over. You would think that would be when slavery finally comes to a crashing end, but it doesn't. And fast forward to June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas. You see, in the farthest reaches of the Confederate States, there was a number of people that would not give up slavery. So 2,000 Union soldiers showed up in Galveston, Texas, where there were 250,000 slaves still in the state of Texas, to say, hey, it's enough, it's over, it's finished. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, changing the Constitution, the Civil War, you've lost, it's done. But to be honest with you, I kind of get it, because I see it everywhere just today. When evil has its grips on us, it doesn't want to let us go. And so you wonder why. Goodness gracious, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and there are still slaves happening in our country. Why has it taken us so long? Months after the 13th Amendment has been passed by the Senate and the Congress, hasn't quite been ratified, but goodness, we're moving that direction. Months after the Civil War is completely over and your side has lost, you are still holding on to it. Evil has this funny way of getting its hooks in us, and it just will not let us go. It was the same for slavery. It is the same in our everyday walking around lives now. When evil gets a hold of us, it doesn't want to give us up. You know, if you're listening to this for the first time today and you're realizing that you have a spiritual slavery condition, and you're coming to realize that Jesus has done something on your behalf to purchase and buy and make a way for you to have freedom, and this is the first time you're hearing it, I want to first say, I am so sorry it has taken us this long, because Jesus did this 2,000 years ago. And honestly, there's no excuse for those of us who are followers of Jesus to not have already told you this incredible news. But if that is you, and you're hearing it for the first time and you're wrestling with the idea of spiritual freedom, I want to give you a very simple first step. Simply text the word BEGIN to the number on the screen. We want to begin having a conversation with you about what a spiritual next step in freedom would look like. We want to make it simple. Just text the number on the screen and we'll begin a texting conversation. If you want that conversation to graduate into a phone call, it's up to you. We can do that. If you want to meet in person, we can do that. And now those of you who are followers of Jesus, we started this by saying, hey, there was one thing I wanted to add to your one thing you wanted to hold on in terms of the teaching of Jesus, right? So we've chosen this one thing for this year, for 2023, that we want to hold really tight to and say, you know, I want to dive in and I want to explore and I want to hold tight to this teaching, because I realize it's kind of slipped out of my fingers over time. The one thing that we've got to add to that was very unique to you. This is very universal to us all. And that is this. We have a responsibility as those who know freedom has been purchased on our behalf to let the people who do not know. It's our job. We've got to do more on that side of things. We've got to engage more. And there will be people in our lives this year that honestly, it's up to us. We will be the people walking into their city, letting them know that something has been done on their behalf. And evil is not going to let them go. Evil is not going to give them back. Evil is not going to tell them Jesus died for them. No, we've got to do it. And to be honest with you, it's not enough that it's written in a book, because some people don't read the book. But we can bring the pages of that book and the pages of those stories to life by letting them know that it's not a fairy tale, but Jesus is real and Jesus is alive and Jesus has done something about our spiritual condition, that he offers us freedom, that we can hold on to his teachings, that we can know the truth, and the truth, Jesus, will set us free. Foundation, we've got some work to do this year. We got some work to do. We want to take spiritual steps in terms of identifying and just being honest with ourselves. This is a teaching I've got to grab hold of. And we want to be honest about that. We've got some steps to do there. And we've also got some steps in terms of making sure that there are people who are around who do not know what Jesus has done for them, that they become aware that freedom is theirs. Foundation, it's 2023. And I say, let's get after it. Let's go. Let's make this a year of spiritual freedom, of spiritual steps. I'm in it with you. Are you with me? Let's get to work.